Hello everyone, welcome to Linguistic Exception of English video series. My name is Dedi Kurniawan and I'm going to be the host of this video series which presents various discussions on topics of linguistics. In this video today, I'm going to talk about syntax. The title of my presentation is Introduction to Syntax. Let's start this presentation. In this video, I'm going to talk about syntax as a branch of linguistics dealing with sentences. Now, first of all, O'Grady and Archibald says that not much can be said with a single word. If we are to use language to express complex thoughts and ideas, we must be able to combine and organize words into sentences. It is a fact that with words alone, we cannot really talk about a lot of things. Instead, we have to be able to combine these words and then create sentences that we can use to communicate with each other. Now, it seems that native speakers of a language seems to have an intuition on how to combine and arrange the words in their language to create seemingly infinite and novel utterances. Every day, we as native speakers of our own language talk about a lot of things using different kinds of sentences that we have even never uttered that before. And it seems that we can create an infinite series of utterances, with quite finite components. Now, let's do some observation. Native speakers of English, for example, if they are given the following sentences, the man bought some apples yesterday, or apples yesterday bought man the sum, will be able to tell apart whether a sentence is acceptable or not. In this example, they can know for sure that utterance number one is acceptable, is in some way correct, impossible in their language, while number two is not acceptable, even though we see that the components that create this utterance are the same. They consist of the words like apples yesterday bought, man, the, and some, but arranged in that order, number two, the native speakers of English will surely understand that the second sentence is not really acceptable. And another observation shows that any speakers of any human language can produce and understand an infinite number of sentences. Let's take, for example, these sentences that I copied from Kin. For example, one can say, the kind-hearted boy had many girlfriends. And then he even can further say, the kind-hearted, intelligent boy had many girlfriends. Then the kind-hearted, intelligent, handsome boy had many girlfriends. We can even have added some words like the kind-hearted, intelligent, handsome, rich boy had many girlfriends, and so on and so on. So it seems that we can create longer and longer sentences by adding the components and relatively infinite numbers. And then take a look at the second examples. The cat chased the mouse. Native speakers of English can even go further by adding the components into the cat chased the mouse that ate the cheese. The cat chased the mouse that ate the cheese that came from the cow, and so on and so on. It seems that this observation shows that native speakers of a language can create an infinite number of sentences. They can construct an even larger and larger and larger construction grammatically. Now, so what we can conclude from these observations? Tentatively, we can say that words in a language can be combined into a larger and larger construction in infinite ways and in novel ways. And then native speakers of a language possesses a kind of intuition on how to combine these words and to judge whether a certain construction is acceptable or not. Then when we are talking about this construction, how we combine the words into sentences, this is the the focus of a branch of linguistics called syntax. Okay, and then in this presentation today, we are going to talk about syntax in general. Now, by the end of this lesson, you are expected to be able to comprehend the definition, the scope, and the object, and the basic concept and current trends in syntax. And in particular, you are expected to comprehend the foundation of generative syntax as a theory of syntax. And we will cover several topics today in this video. Number one, we are going to talk about definition of syntax, and then we will continue with the scope and objects of syntax, and then we will discuss some basic concept in syntax. And in the end of my presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about generative syntax or generative grammar, and some concept on that kind of theory. Okay, now let's go on to the main content. So what is syntax? In general, or simply, syntax is a branch of linguistics dealing with sentence structure. Okay, and then according to Yule, syntax concentrate on the structure and the ordering of components within a sentence. The word syntax epistemologically derived from a Greek word which means putting together or arrangement, right? So syntax is the component of grammar that is concerned with the form of grammatical sentences in which we are talking about the structure and the order of the words and how the words are ordered into grammatical sentences. So syntax as a branch of linguistics deal with how words are combined into phrases, clauses, and sentences. These are some technical terms in linguistics, and we are going to discuss about this in my other videos. But for now, I think we can simply say that syntax deal with phrases, clauses, and sentences. And then Carney says, syntax studies the level of language that lies between words and the meaning of utterances. It is the level that mediates between the sounds that someone produces, organized into words, and what they intend to say. Let me show you in this diagram. So in the previous videos, we have already talked about phonetics as the science or the branch of linguistics dealing with sound segments. This sound segment can be combined into phonemes into syllables, syllables into morpheme, word. And now in syntax, we are dealing with phrase, clause, and sentences as the combination of the words that we discuss in morphology, and we are going to try to connect it with semantics, another level of linguistics dealing with meaning. Okay, so basically syntax unit of analysis can be divided into phrases, clauses, and sentences. And I'm not going to talk deeply into that about phrase, sentence, and clause, because we will have another video for that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the differentiation between syntax and grammar, because people sometimes confuse these terms. The two terms are actually often used interchangeably in spite of technical differences. So in some way they can be said as representing different ideas or concept, but actually they have some similarities, so they can sometimes be interchangeably used. And in this presentation, I'm going to use them as we are going to assume that they have a relatively similar meaning. Okay. However, in general, we can say that syntax should be used to refer to a field of study. So syntax is a study dealing with the sentence, while grammar is has a more tendency to be a kind of rules or a kind of formulas. Yeah. In even in linguistics, grammar is considered to be a wider term comprising phonology, morphology, and syntax. So when we are referring to grammatical knowledge, we are talking about someone's ability in phonology, morphology, and syntax. Okay, because in order to be able to communicate, they should have an understanding of the sound system of a language, the morphological system, and also the syntax. So it's a much wider term. And then, furthermore, grammar can also be used in two senses. Number one, grammar is sometimes used to refer to the rules as prescribed by grammarians or grammar books, aka the formula. But grammar in linguistics can be strictly used as referring to inherent knowledge of native speakers of their own language. That is, what is acceptable or what is not acceptable. Now, let's talk about the theories of syntax. Uh, O'Grady states that the study of syntax lies very close to the heart of contemporary linguistic analysis, and work in this area is notorious both for its diversity and complexity. So when we're talking about syntax theories, we are not talking about a singular theory. Instead, there are a lot of theories being studied by people, and these theories are evolving quite rapidly and quite expensively. So we can say that syntax is one of the branches in linguistic which is still evolving expensively and rapidly, and probably one of the most complex, in the sense that it has there are many theories going on. So in terms of the theories, the models, syntax is quite rich. And okay, now before we go on with the syntax theories, let me briefly review the schools of linguistics. So far, there are four uh, notable or four famous linguistic schools or linguistic approaches. The first one is structural linguistics, and then the second one is functional linguistics, and then the third is generative linguistics, and the last one is considered to be cognitive linguistics. I have already mentioned. Also, I have already included the names of the founders. And then generative syntax is one of the theory which is quite dominant nowadays. And this one is introduced by Chomsky in 1950s and is still continuing until today. And it is probably one of the most extensively studied theory. And from this single theory comes a lot of branches or a lot of theories uh, as a response to, as as a kind of um, as a kind of extension, as well as debates or argumentation against uh, the theory itself. So in general, generative syntax or generative grammar is a cover term to the many theories under Chomskyan generativism that continue to evolve and trigger newer theories. So under these blanket terms, we can have some terms like transformational grammar, government binding theory, principles and parameter, minimalism or minimal program, and optimality theory, and so on and so forth. And I uh, call the principles and parameter theory, as we are going to deal a lot with this approach or with this theory, a particular version of generative grammar. So the underlying thesis of generative grammar is that sentences are generated by a subconscious set of procedures like computer programs. So hence the word generative. Generativism contends that syntax is cognitive science aimed at describing and explaining human beings' ability to think, which is generally termed as human cognition. And the goal of syntactic theory, according to generativism, is to create a model that explains the subconscious procedures in the minds of native speakers of language, i.e., what we know when we know language. So basically, generative grammar posits that human minds has capacity, the so-called human language capacity, that will be able to generate a set of sentences or utterances from finite sets of elements or words. Okay, so when as much as model is concerned, so this is one of the models proposed by Carney. This is not the complete model, but we are going to use this simplified version of the models known as principles and parameter models as the basis of our course. So maybe you are not really familiar with this model or diagram, but we are going to base our course, whole course, on this model. So we can read this model as we can start from the lexicon or the words or the vocabulary becoming an input to a certain set of rules called X-bar rules, and then this will create the so-called D structure, and then we are going to deal with transformation that will lead to another type of structure called S structure. Then based on the grammaticality judgment by the native speakers of a language, we'll create a grammatical utterances or sentences. So based on this model, so we are going to set the course into several stages. In the first part, we are going to talk about syntactic categories or part of speech. And then after that, we are going to talk about the rules, the X-bar rules, a version of X-bar rules, and the constituency. And after that, we are going to talk about transformation. And then we will talk about the some filters, for example, theta criterion and EPP, extended projection principles, so on and so forth. So we are going to develop this course based on these notions. Now, let me talk about some concepts in generative grammar. Number one, Chomsky, as the founder of generative grammar, posits the differences between competence and performance. Performance refers to the kinds of language that are actually produced and heard, while competence refers to what we know about our language. So it's more of the abstract elements or the abstract notions or cognition in human brains that enables them to use language. Okay, while performance is more of the actual utterances performed by a speaker. Focus of linguistics, according to Chomsky, is to study this competence. And then number two, we are going to talk about I language and E language. Language with capital letters L or I language refers to human language capacity, that is parts of the mind or brain that enables human to use language. So I language universally exists in human. Okay, so we use the term I language or language with capital L to refer to the system, to the abstract system in human minds. While language with small l or E language is the instantiation of that ability, that is the actual product of human minds. That is the language that they really utter or use in their communications. Linguistics, at least in genetivism, attempts to study I language while using E language as a source of data to explain the phenomenon. So the primary goal of generative grammar is actually to describe this I language or the human language capacity. Some other courses, some other schools of linguistics are more keen to studying the E language or the real performance. The main goal, therefore, of generative grammar is to unravel the so-called the universal grammar. And then we also need to differentiate between learning and acquisition. As a subconscious knowledge, language is acquired, not learned. For example, through immersions. So we know that language is a kind of ability that we do not really need to learn. Instead, like walking, um, language is acquired through immersion, through contact with other people. However, not all human knowledge comes from acquisition. Some of them are inherent. They are already built in human brains, and this is called innate or inherent capacity of human language. Um, this hypothesis, called innateness hypothesis, is proposed by Chomsky, stating that language is like an instinct. It's a built-in, a subconscious knowledge owned by human beings. And language is an inherent capacity owned by human. Uh, Much of the language is an ability hardwired into our brains or by our genes. Okay, and universal grammar, uh, which is the target or the goal of generative syntax, is the innate or the instinctual part of each language grammar. When we are talking about universal grammar, we sometimes differentiate between universals and particular. Universals is a property found in all languages of the world. For example, in all languages, we have subject, verb, and objects. However, some different languages have specific or particular variables of how these subject, verb, and object are arranged. For example, in some languages like English or Bahasa Indonesia, the arrangement should be subject, verb, and object. But some other languages, for example, Japanese, have subject, object, verb arrangements, while some others, even though not really common, have VSO, verb, subject, object arrangements. Now, these universal and particulars are sometimes referred by the terms principles and parameters. So hence this version of generative grammar gets its name, principles and parameters. So how linguistics and in particular how syntax is studied? First of all, we need to know that language can sometimes be learned descriptively or prescriptively. And linguistics prefer to study descriptive language descriptively, that is, study the language as is instead of using prescriptive, which is language is prescribed or there are norms. So linguistic tend to study language descriptively, meaning they try to see language as language, what language is, instead of setting the rules or setting the norms, things like that. Linguistic as descriptive study prefer the term grammatical versus ungrammatical, or well-formed versus ill-formed. So instead of saying correct or incorrect, good or bad, linguistics try to use the term grammatical to state that a sentence or a construction is well-formed, or ungrammatical when the structure is or the construction is ill-formed. Okay, and linguistics tend to focus more on the competence rather than performance, i.e., linguistics try to target the abstract concept rather than the actual representation of the abstract. So we use the actual representation, the speech, the utterances spoken by the people as a source of data, but we try to derive from that the abstract concept or the abstract description of the language. And then the linguistic focuses on establishing the rules for I language rather than E language, as I mentioned before. So that's I think that's my presentation. In summary, as a summary, syntax is a branch of linguistics dealing with sentence structure. Syntax studies how words are combined into phrases, clauses, and sentences. Syntax is at the core of contemporary linguistic theory because of its diversity and complexity. Then we also talk about generative grammar as a blanket term for many theories of syntax, and is considered to be one of the most developed and most studied theory of syntax. And in particular, our course will deal with one version of generative grammar, which is called principles and parameter. And then the main aim of generative grammar, including PNP, is to develop a model that explains the procedures of how words are combined into phrases, clauses, and sentences grammatically. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Here are some words of the day from this presentation. We have some concepts that we need to learn or consider. I would like you to try to study these words, study these concepts in depth by reading the books. Okay, and I think this is my bibliography. Thank you. Okay, so I think that's my presentation on syntax. Some introductory concept on syntax that we need to know before we proceed to different videos. In the next video, I'm going to talk about syntactic categories as the starting or as the first component that we are going to deal with in syntax. I think that's all from me. I'm Dedi Kurniawan. Thank you very much.